Prime Minister, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we now hand over to our moderator to lead us through the conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Ong, board member, Biduri Bank Group. Dr. Tim, it's over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for the warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this conversation on the future of ASEAN in this ASEAN Business and Investment Summit. My name is Timothy Ong, and I'm joining this conversation from Bandar Seri Begawan, where it is a lovely Monday morning. With me are an excellent panel. We have Parag Khanna, Dr. Parag Khanna, thought leader, author, founder, and managing partner of Future Map Singapore. We have John Graham, the CEO of Zulik Pharma. Welcome, John. Welcome, Parag. We have Agneta Johnsgaard-Lewis, the country chair of Shell in Brunei. Welcome, Agneta. And we have Sasaki Nobuhiko, the chairman and CEO of Japan External Trade Organization, better known as JETRO. Welcome, all of you. I'd like to begin the conversation with a big picture question. And I would like to direct this to you, Parag. You have thought deeply and written extensively about Asia's place in the world. I want to ask you regarding ASEAN's place in Asia, and by extension, ASEAN's place in the world. As you know, ASEAN was founded 54 years ago, and in the heart of the Cold War, when the world was very different. 54 years later, at a time of tensions between the great powers, at a time when COVID-19 is wreaking so much damage in our economies, how is ASEAN relevant today? Parag.
Thank you so much, Dr. Timothy. It's a pleasure to join all of you, and I appreciated hearing the remarks of the Prime Minister and the earlier comments and presentation with a lot of interesting data that shows the progress that the ASEAN region has been making in terms of, for example, the steadiness or the increase of intra-regional trade dynamics, for example. Now, I'm very glad you've asked this question because, of course, when we speak about the world economy, it's only very recently that we treat the ASEAN region or Southeast Asian region and ASEAN as a coherent entity and as an entity with significant weight. And that's certainly justified given the steady growth rates, the V-shaped recovery that we're hoping to achieve in the region, the overall trajectory, both demographically in terms of urbanization, economic diversification, the youth, the share of the demographics, and the fact that, therefore, if you put all of that together, this becomes a region that is poised to be the fourth largest economic region in the world in the coming decades. I'll note that it's worth differentiating between the vast potential of the Southeast Asian region in terms of its demographics, its geography, the role that it plays, that its individual members play with respect to their economic and other relationships around the world, and ASEAN as an institution, which in some ways represents these countries, but in other ways, of course, doesn't. It is not a supranational body. But let's hold them, to be more or less synonymous in this conversation for the sake of looking at ASEAN structurally. And it is important, therefore, that we view ASEAN as one of the pillars of Asia. Now, a lot of people have fallen into the trap over the last couple of decades of focusing largely on China as the central actor in Asia. But we do have to view Asia much more broadly as a system. And within that system, there is a pivotal role as pillars, really, for Japan, for China, for ASEAN, for India, for Australia or Australasia and the oceanic countries, and other key players. You mentioned the history of ASEAN's founding more than a generation ago, 2 generations ago during the Cold War. Let's remember that really 30 years ago, when the Soviet Union collapsed, is the point at which we can really mark this broader Asian region and its various sub-regional geographies and clusters, beginning that process of much more rapid integration with each other, both internally as sub-regions such as ASEAN and then across them. And the story begins with the super cycle, the commodities super cycle, for example, linking the Gulf countries to East Asian economies. And that's an important reminder of how we need to think about Asia as this much broader geography. Over the past 30 years, these West Asian countries have become much more aligned economically in terms of trade flows, investment flows, with other Asian countries than with their historical colonial era trade, investment, and political partners. And over the last 30 years, we've not only seen that super cycle, but we've also witnessed, of course, growing infrastructure investment, deepening trade frameworks, the RCEP, and of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, and other programs that have basically helped to liberate or unlock the complementarities among all Asian economies. And if we look back at the share of Asian trade that is internal or within or between Asian countries, going back to 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020, we've seen a very, very steady advance in that intra-Asian trade component. So much so that now Asia ranks only just behind the European Union in terms of the share of total trade that is internal to the region. And that's been achieved largely in the last 20 years, which is a really remarkable accomplishment. Now, ASEAN plays a increasingly central role in all of this, as has been emphasized already in the preceding presentations. And I think that the promise, the structural promise, is very, very strong. Again, I mentioned the demographics already, but let's just look at the ways in which not only RCEP, but also the geopolitics, which has not yet been mentioned, are going to reinforce this. Because there is now a strategic willpower to diversify supply chains, to diversify the geography of production, to ensure that there is not a single point of failure or a single origin market of production dependence in Asia, specifically, of course, China. And therefore, I think that we will see those foreign investment volumes really continue to rise in this region. And importantly, we'll see the internal barriers and internal frictions, I should say, come down and allow for ASEAN to become a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And it's taken a long time for that, sort of vision or that goal to be in view, in sight, that ASEAN can genuinely be a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what the growing deregulation and cross-border economic activity is certainly promoting. It's what foreign investors want to see, so that you can have more economies of scale across the region, so that firms can really access in a more frictionless way each of the major ASEAN economies, and so that their output can start to match their size. Let's remember that even though that this is a very worthy objective, in terms of overall manufacturing output, China still massively dominates. Many people still view ASEAN as really the beneficiary of simply so-called China plus one kinds of supply chain allocation. But if we look at the population size and its the massive gains to productivity that can and should be achieved through greater foreign investment, I think that ASEAN can gradually punch above its weight. Let's remember that ASEAN, with half the population of India, has a larger GDP than India. Just on the eve of the pandemic, ASEAN was attracting almost the same volume of greenfield foreign investment as China was. So the momentum is very, very strong. And I think that despite the difficulties that the pandemic has presented, what we've witnessed over the last 20 plus years of iterative crises is that ASEAN governments have learned to respond relatively quickly in terms of the necessary reforms. The 98 Asian financial crisis, the SARS epidemic, the financial crisis of 2008, and now the pandemic, each has presented different kinds of shocks. But what we've seen is that the capacity of states and regulators to to respond to these shocks, to take note of the lessons and to act upon them, and most of all, to act upon them not only through domestic reforms, through fiscal stimulus and other kinds of measures, but also to open more to each other and to, again, to exploit those complementarities and to realize that they must become more codependent, more interdependent, more efficient together, has been one of the consistent lessons across these moments of crisis, again, going back from 1998 through the present. So I do think that all of those factors, the structural, trade, infrastructure, investment realities, the foreign investment flows, the geopolitical exigencies, and the demographic and other realities, both the top-down and the bottom-up, are contributing to ASEAN really, I think, pulling its weight increasingly as a pillar of this broader Asian system, and therefore as a key hub for the entire world economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to return to you after this first round of questions in terms of the kind of challenges that ASEAN must watch out for, because this is a kind of precarious world order that we confront. You may have a more optimistic view of the way the world is unfolding, and ASEAN needs to adapt to this new geopolitical situation, but we'll return to that. I now want to turn to getting some business views. John and Agneta, you both run significant enterprises in ASEAN. John, Zulik Pharma is a $13 billion business in 13 Asian economies. And Agneta, you are the country chair of Shell Brunei, which is Brunei's most significant enterprise. What has been the impact of the pandemic on your business, and what have you learned in terms of preparing for the future? Let's start with you, John, and then we'll have Agneta's views.
Thank you, Dr. Tim, for having me today. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to address this group of people. And also, it's a great opportunity for me to represent our industry and other industries within the region. I think in terms of healthcare, which is where our business is focused, manufacturers, distributors, and healthcare providers have all grappled with ensuring that healthcare is available and accessible to broader populations across the region, even under normal circumstances. It's been, of course, particularly challenging in countries with large populations spread across huge geographies, sometimes very disparate geographies with many, many islands in some cases, where transportation, logistics, the mobility of people is a huge challenge, and getting goods in and out of isolated areas of these countries is difficult. I think as far as the pandemic is concerned, these challenges have been even more exacerbated, and it became really actually apparent during the lockdown, the restrictions, the movement control situations that were put in place, where we were in a situation as a company where we were had to deliver sometimes life-saving medication or devices to hospitals, to patients, to doctors and hospitals in far-flung areas of countries, and we're not able to move around very easily. Later on in the pandemic, of course, the issue of the race of getting populations vaccinated as fast as possible further, I think, highlighted key challenges in the infrastructure weaknesses that we see in some of the countries across ASEAN, and getting vaccine, particularly those vaccines that are temperature sensitive to hard to reach remote areas, has been a big undertaking, not only for distributors, but for everybody involved across the supply chain. So I think for us, there were two key lessons that we have been able to draw from our time in managing healthcare supply during the pandemic. One is that collaboration with key stakeholders throughout the supply chain is absolutely vital. And I think in a business as usual environment, sometimes we forget that there are stakeholders in the chain, in the value chain, that can provide more or less value depending on the situation and the environment that you're in. But we found very clearly that collaboration of our organization with government, not only at the national level, but also at a regional, state, even city level, was absolutely crucial to making sure that medical products and services could be delivered in a timely manner to the patients that needed them. And sometimes we had to collaborate, or we needed to collaborate with branches of government which we normally wouldn't even have had any relationship with. So normally our relationships are with Ministry of Health, with regulatory bodies dealing with healthcare. But the pandemic saw us collaborating with, in some cases, the armed forces, in other cases, the police, just to be able to get passes and licenses to move product from A to B within the country. And this really was something that was duplicated across all countries, regardless of the level of development. Most countries were just not prepared for these sudden breakdown in transportation and access, and sometimes within, well, either overnight or within days, which meant that we really had to ramp up all our activities and draw on our relationships with governments at all levels to make sure that product could move from A to B. I think the second key learning for us, as we now move into even now the second stage of the pandemic, which is the vaccination and the endemic stage, is that the digitalization of healthcare is probably no longer a dream to be pursued over the longer term, but it's an absolute necessity in bringing healthcare, especially to the populations of ASEAN, which, as I said, many of whom are in far-flung and remote areas. And it goes beyond, the need for reliable and up-to-date information and data on which to act, but also it's a fundamental shift in the way that healthcare is delivered. We've seen a clear shift from in-person to online interactions, not only between patients and physicians, but also between companies in a B2B environment, where we ourselves shifted our entire ordering process and payments process over the last few months from a heavily manual face-to-face interaction dependent process to now very quickly a largely digital process, which I think probably seems quite obvious now that we look back on it. But I think the key learning in this process has been how easily technology can be adapted and accepted in an environment where there's an emergency and a real political will to get things done. And linked to that, I would say, is the fact that governments collaborating with the private sector today can indeed move things very quickly. It's possible to accelerate new technology, even in some cases ahead of developed markets, because a lot of the barriers to entry are a lot lower. And we were driven by digital because we saw the benefits of harnessing these tools. We were already on that path and had made key investments in digital solutions. But the pandemic has really been a catalyst to bringing these digital solutions to fruition. I would say the same thing goes for virtual consultation platforms, where over the last few years we've seen a slow growth in virtual consultations with physicians. But over the last few months, the acceptance of virtual interaction with physicians, virtual prescriptions, direct-to-patient delivery of products have become more the norm than we would have expected. And that development probably would have taken decades in the past. So really, I think the second lesson here is the fact that the pandemic has accelerated many things beyond our dreams. And that just shows that with collaboration between private and public sector, as well as the political will to get things done, can move things to improve healthcare delivery across Asia much quicker than we had anticipated.
Thank you very much. Collaboration and digitalization. At some point, I'd like to develop this challenge of digitalization and get your views on how this promise can be fulfilled in a region as disparate as ASEAN, because digitalization requires infrastructure, it requires access to the digital world, and this is very uneven in ASEAN. Agneta, how has the pandemic impacted your business, and what have you learned in terms of preparing for the future? You are on mute.
Let's try to go off mute. Digitalization indeed. Thank you, Dr. Timothy, and thank you for the opportunity to join the session here today. Yes, so what is it meant for the business and what have we learned? So I think for the Brunei Shell joint ventures, we are in such a unique position here in Brunei. The lights will literally go off if we stop doing what we do as we power the hospital, schools, and all the essential services through providing all the domestic power in country. So we are very cognizant and very clear on the priority and need really to adapt, and maybe that's point one in terms of what we've learned, and I'll come back to that. I think the other part of it, of course, is that we provide crude oil and LNG to countries all over the ASEAN, as well as Australia, India, and Japan. So again, our responsibility to continue despite the challenge is very clear. We have to deliver through the entire value chain from upstream all the way down to delivering to our market and customers. What we've seen, of course, is that different parts of the world are in very different stages as COVID has hit. And I think this is where our opportunity comes in direct learning. We try to learn, especially from our neighbors in the ASEAN. But I think also being a large company or affiliated with a large company, we also try to learn from different parts of the world and how they went through it. In Brunei, we've been very blessed. It's really the second wave, which only occurred a couple of months ago, which probably has put more constraint on us than what we've seen. And I think one point that I think John alluded to is really vaccination. You know, how do we get vaccines to the population at large so that we can really reopen in a more normality. And that for me is maybe one of the key lessons here is how, again, we see examples across the world. We see how getting the large vaccination rates are helping to revert to more normal. So that's one of the challenges. And one of the things that we work directly with as part of the company is supporting and ensuring that our frontliners are indeed vaccinated so that we don't see interruptions. I think there's also an opportunity to accelerate the strategic and operational and a part of that is, again, digitalization. I think globally, the pandemic has pushed the world to go through a rapid digital transformation, which has its own challenges, but it also provides some real opportunities. We have seen for the last few years digital as an opportunity for us as a company and a business. But I think what the pandemic's caused is actually an acceleration here. So as an example, while our frontliners are working in what we call bubbles to safeguard operation and our people, those that are working in the office now are working remotely. And we are really connected in a completely different way, being forced to really embrace digitalization. And you also see how people are looking at it and finding the opportunity. And I think that's always one of these things. I think as humans, we're incredibly adaptive. And when the challenge is thrown to us, we start innovating, and we really see that there is a change here, and just a familiarity, which I think will serve us now, and it will serve us in the future as we leverage partnerships to effectively a digital transformation. As with other industries during this pandemic, volatility is expected. However, for us, our objectives remain constant, and that's really to safely deliver secure power and revenue to the country, and provide a steady and secure energy supply for all our customers. So for us, this is not really a shift about what we do, but rather the way we do it. And going back to what we learned, I think we really learned to adapt, and we've learned to collaborate. It's interesting to hear John's reflections. Of course, we typically collaborate with the ministers of energy and finance. But what we see now is also much more deeply a collaboration with the Ministry of Health to ensure that we really stay safe. So I think collaborating with the various bodies, as well as with our business partners, to really ensure that we can continue to safely deliver our products.
Thank you. The pandemic has changed the way we all work. So more and more people are now working remotely. I'd like to have a quick comment from John and Agneta as well. In terms of the way you work today in response to the pandemic, how much of that will carry through into the future, you think, when we are past the pandemic at some point?
John, I'll let you go, Agneta.
How much? So I think it's actually giving an opportunity, which maybe in the past we kind of question how effective can we be working virtually. At the same time, I think we're all asking that maybe the travel we used to do in the past, is it really required? As we become more proficient at working with the digital tools and collaboration space, because I mean that's really at the crux of it. How do you effectively collaborate if you're sitting in different countries, in different locations? So I actually think the challenge upon all of us is how we use the tools we're learning and the skills everybody's acquiring to really work more efficiently and in better ways. Because I do think it is also providing what we see is some of we see people are able to maybe get a better work-life balance as well, particularly if you have long commutes. Is there an opportunity there to find this new way of working in a collaborative space? So I think it's upon all of us to take the best of it and continue it as we go forward, and adapt, really. I see opportunities here.
John, you have a comment to make here? Before we turn to Sasaki.
I think many of the changes that have taken place in our work lives are here to stay permanently. I think every company today is probably re-examining how they work, how the teams work together, etc. And I think we've been forced, as Agneta was saying, to work remotely. And I think we've discovered actually how productive, or sometimes we can be even more productive by working remotely. We've seen in Zulik Pharma that sometimes team meetings done remotely can work more efficiently because everyone gets a chance to speak and everyone listens more intently. But of course, then longer meetings become a real chore. If you had to sit 4 or 5 hours in front of a screen for one meeting, that becomes very difficult. But I think it's very often easy to generalize when we speak about working from home. I think working from home, especially in ASEAN, means different things to different people. In many ASEAN homes, you have 3 generations of people in the home, living usually in a quite small space. So whether the actual work environment is conducive or even attractive for people to remain at home, I think is the question that needs to be examined and taken into account across, of course, all the different hierarchies in the business, right? It's also, I think, a question of many of our newer employees over the last 2 years might not even have seen an office building or a warehouse that belongs to Zulig, and so the connection with the company is something that I think is something that we need to reinvent. How we onboard new employees and give them the feeling of being part of a company, part of a community, and impart the vision and the mission of what we do. I think all of these things have probably taken a back seat to some extent through remote work. And if we are to continue to work remotely or even in hybrid modalities, then we have to rethink how that happens in the future. So I think there are many different aspects of the new normal, so to speak, that we haven't yet really explored sufficiently. And I think that the last aspect is mental health. I think that mental health of our workforce is becoming more important as a focus area because we just don't interact with them at the same level that we used to. And perhaps there are areas that we're missing in terms of making sure that people are supported correctly in the work that they do.
Thank you, Sasaki-san. Japanese companies are major investors and trading partners throughout ASEAN. How has the pandemic affected their businesses, and how have they responded to the disruptions in the supply chain?
Okay, I'm Sasaki Nobuhiko, Chairman and CEO of JETRO. As an affiliated organization of the Japanese government that connects Japan and overseas economies, we have 10 offices in ASEAN and support the activities of 9,000 Japanese companies located in ASEAN. ASEAN forms the hub of the manufacturing supply chains in East Asia. Japanese companies in ASEAN are also deeply incorporated into it. About 90% of Japanese companies procure and sell in Japan, China, and ASEAN, and each is linked. Therefore, if a disruption occurs in any of these regions, the effect is great. Since the spring of last year, the corona crisis has affected the supply chains in almost all industries, including semiconductors and automobiles, causing delays in the production of final products and intermediate goods. JETRO has been engaged in various activities to strengthen supply chains and has found 3 important points. The first is the diversification of the supply chains, increasing the options of the sources of procurement and supply in preparation for supply chain disruptions. The second is visualization of the supply chains, quickly identifying the location of problem when it occurs. The third is to respond to new sense of values for the supply chains, consideration for human rights, and the environment in procurement and supply. If I may, I would like to continue to the points of supply chain strengthening. The first, corona crisis has forced companies to suspend production lines and caused a stagnation in logistics due to delays in customs clearance worldwide. In line with this, the companies have been forced to halt operation or reduce production. In one JETRO survey conducted in December last year, 1/4 of Japanese companies in ASEAN responded that they plan to reconsider their suppliers. The results of the survey indicate it is necessary to support business activities leading to strengthened supply chains. One example of diversification is a project conducted by the Japan Freight Railway Company. Due to the increasing logistic volume within ASEAN, congestion near land borders of the region has become a major problem. Here, the company has been conducting a feasibility study for introducing the know-how of Japanese railway operation using IT systems, which will contribute to diversifying the transportation modes and realizing convenient and reliable door-to-door international railway transportation. Diversification means to increase the options of supply and procurement, but that option should be reasonable and competitive. So what the government can do is to help support the increasing those options. But this case of Japan Freight Railway is one example of doing that. Another keyword for strengthening supply chains is visualization. Through visualizing supply chains, problems can be quickly discovered and dealt with. Digital technologies are effective in realizing this. Visualization of supply chains makes it possible to optimize the supply chains by utilizing data. Also, by using the same visualizing platform and sharing the real-time data, users can further streamline the supply chains. Here I give you one example of visualization of Trade Vaults. Trade Vaults is a trading platform which enables the digitalization of trade practices. Is a good example of visualization of supply chains. When we talk about trade transactions, there are many players in the process, such as exporters, importers, insurance firms, banks, and logistics firms. This results in high complexity, and the decentralization of information and complicated paperwork have long been issues. Trade Vaults facilitates traceability and information management by enabling information sharing in an integrated manner. This endeavor also eyes interconnection with existing trade platforms in ASEAN. We hope that in collaboration with governments and ASEAN digital circles, these efforts will facilitate trade procedures and increase procurement and supply options between companies. And about regarding the new values of supply chain, I would like to comment in the discussion that follows. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So diversification, visualization. I'd like to return to you, Parag. And I have actually two questions. You are one of the most traveled people in the world, possibly. You have visited 150 countries. And I was just going to ask you, in the light of the pandemic, whether you envisage yourself continuing to travel in the way that you have. But before getting that, I want to dig deeper into your assessment of ASEAN's relevance. You gave a pretty optimistic assessment to ASEAN. In your assessment, ASEAN's looking at the demographics, the structural factors, the trade flows, the geopolitical configurations, ASEAN will continue to punch likely above its weight. But at the same time, there was a cautionary note that with the dominance of China in Asia, that ASEAN would be very much in the Chinese shadow, so to speak. What are the challenges in terms of ASEAN's continued relevance, in terms of its continued ability to punch above its weight? What would be the key challenge there? And then along the way, if you could share with us your thoughts in terms of your travel plans.
Sure. Great question. So I think we have to look at the domestic versus the regional or global challenges to ASEAN. The first is when it comes to the geopolitics, many people may view China's inexorable rise as automatically leading to ASEAN not only being under China's shadow, but quite frankly, under Chinese hegemony. But that need not be the case. And I think it's one of the great misperceptions of geopolitics in general and Asian geopolitics in particular, that there need be a single hegemon. And this really is derivative of a very poor understanding in Western international relations theory, and quite frankly of the kind of longer arc of history, and a lack of awareness about Asian history, because most of Asian history has been multipolar in nature, and Asia, again, is multipolar. The fact that there is one power that is more powerful than others, perhaps even some might say preponderant, does not mean that the system itself is not multipolar and that you will not have various dynamics, balancing dynamics, and efforts to build coalitions to restrain either that dominant power or to assert one's own interests despite that power. And that's very much what we see happening in Asia today. And Southeast Asia is very much at the crossroads of those efforts. And you can see not only that the Southeast Asian countries seek to stand up for themselves, but of course that Australia, United States, Japan, India, United Kingdom, and many other countries are now seeking to support those efforts. So it is, as I've been saying for quite a few years, quite frankly, it is not the case that China will necessarily dominate Asia, even if it has ambitions of dominance. Because really we have to view it as a very dynamic system in which the efforts to, again, buttress the sovereignty of non-China countries in the region are really just gaining steam. So I don't think that we can make any linear projections there. The other challenge is sort of, quote unquote, domestic within ASEAN. And I'd like to, perhaps just engage everyone in a small thought experiment. Because if ASEAN were a country, imagine, or a supranational grouping such as the European Union, it would be by far the most unequal region of the planet Earth, right? Because Africa does not have nearly as many billionaires and ultra high net worth individuals as the ASEAN region has. It does not have countries with per capita GDPs that are approximating those of Brunei or Singapore. Meanwhile, there are still, of course, several hundred million poor people in ASEAN. So if ASEAN were a country, it would certainly be the most unequal country in the world. And that, to me, is, I think, the area where our focus needs to lie. Because countries that don't have economic sovereignty, that aren't pursuing economic modernization, that aren't reducing inequality or raising the floor and alleviating poverty, are going to be vulnerable to exploitation in a number of ways. And of course, that's what we've seen happening in ASEAN. So I would like to see ASEAN countries simply continue the very strong path that they have rightly been on in terms of poverty alleviation, infrastructure investment, individual empowerment of families and households through those investments, through digitization, urbanization, and other forces, job creation, and so forth, skills training. A lot more can be done. And in doing so, it will make the region more attractive to investment. And that, in turn, helps to limit the dependence of any one country on a foreign investor such as China. So all of these domestic and international factors, quite frankly, do tie very, very, very intimately to each other. And we should embrace the sort of the contiguity and the influence of those issues with each other, not have parallel conversations about geopolitics, economics, social policy, investment, trade, and so forth. All of these things are simultaneously equally important. That's certainly a lesson that I've learned from my travels around ASEAN. I have not been traveling all too much in the region simply because of the restrictions. But if it's any indication, in the last 1 month, I've been in Dubai, Istanbul, Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, London, Madrid, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. So things are kind of, at least for me, returning to the pre-pandemic sort of paradigm. Apologies to the COP26 delegates for my rampant greenhouse gas emissions, although, of course, they're not any better as they fly to Glasgow right now. But I do think, and in the spirit of the comments also made earlier, much more can and should be done remotely, for sure. And that we should exercise a bit more restraint than I just have in terms of our movements.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask for a quick comment. Are there things that face-to-face contact can do that remote communications cannot do? So I think this is a good question for you to answer, Parag, because I mean, you are traveling the world, speaking to people, having meetings, consulting. Why can't that be done remotely? What is it about face-to-face contact that virtual communications cannot do? This is obviously early days. We are still in some kind of transition to some kind of a new normal. But, maybe a quick preliminary answer to this.
Sure. I mean, the simple answer is the ability to make your own judgment. For the past 20 years, I've immersed in the literature substantively or regionally or thematically for every place that I travel to and research. But at least my own writing has emerged from the contradictions between what I read and what I see. So if you were to strip away from me the privilege, of access to make my own judgment based upon what I see, I'd be limited to simply what I've read or what people have told me. But I think we all know better than to simply accept at face value, secondhand information. So I, for one, still consider it an intimate part of my methodology for everything I do to go and see and make judgments for myself.
I'd like to invite a comment from Agneta, and then John, if you have something to share on this.
Thank you. And I've not traveled to 150 countries, but I've lived on 5 continents. So what can you not do virtually that you can do face to face? So I think it's in the subtlety. I honestly think it's in subtlety. So what we've seen in other parts, or what I've experienced, is when it comes to executing a plan, that works quite well in a sort of digital world, and you don't, when you know which parts and when you're going to do it. I think what meeting people face to face, the differentiator is when you want to innovate, when you really want to get creative, because then you also need to pick up on those subtle things and unstructured parts. And I think maybe that's what you're also referring to, Parag. When we sit face to face like this, there is a frame you work within. And what you don't see is what's outside the frame, and that's the piece that meeting face to face, and even I think talking about newcomers to the business, of course, picking up on what the daily task is simple enough, and you can do that in this digital way. But you don't know what you don't know, so picking up somebody talking by the coffee corner about something that's completely different, I think that sparks a different sort of thought process, and maybe I didn't think about that. So creating that affiliation, I think, when you actually meet people and do that face to face. But so I don't think it's one or the other. I think you need to have both.
John, a quick comment.
Yeah, I agree with both Parag and Annette, of course. I think for me it's the richness of the inputs that you receive when you have a face-to-face interaction. Much of what we do online with video conferencing or on Zoom or whatever literally ends up being one-dimensional or two-dimensional, and you miss a lot of the subtleties that come through discussions, the informality of interactions outside of a scripted meeting, let's say, or even the opportunity to pull somebody aside to have an offline discussion. All these things, I think, help in the building relationships, building trust, importantly, and also help to speed things along when there are misunderstandings. They can be dealt with immediately, rather than having to set up yet another call for an hour to get to the facts. So I think it is going to continue to be an essential part of how we do business. Just the question is whether the balance now will change.
We have 2 questions here, and I'd like to connect them because they touch on what has been raised in this conversation so far. The first question is from Abdullah Masood. Can the panel elaborate further as to how they are adapting greater digitalization in their businesses? Maybe this one, I would, so instead of everyone answering every question, I'll direct this question. I'll direct this one to Agneta, in terms of how the pandemic has accelerated digital transformation in the companies that you are involved in. There's a question from Jan Tynan Parker from Sydney, Australia, about the uneven access to the digital world throughout ASEAN. Parag made the point that tackling disparity and inequality in ASEAN is a major challenge and must be addressed seriously. This question is, how is this shortfall going to be managed in the short to mid-term in order not to leave these countries out of the rapid rollout and digitization of medical and healthcare sector? So maybe this is a question for John, if you are up to taking this question, because you talk about the importance of digital transformation in rolling out healthcare services. But we are talking, as Parag reminded us, of the most unequal region in the world, with some very wealthy members like Singapore and Brunei, and others that are really struggling in terms of their economies, like Myanmar and Laos. So how do we ensure that this access is more evenly distributed within ASEAN? And how do we tackle the short-term challenge of the disparity? And then I just see another question from Oliver Pritchard. What are some of the ways to help less developed ASEAN countries strengthen online learning? I'm not sure whether there's a volunteer for this. Parag, is this something that, with your encyclopedic knowledge, you could tackle? So let's start with Agneta, and then on your digitalization program, and then John, in terms of disparity in digital access, and then Parag on ASEAN countries strengthening online learning. And then I'd like to then turn to Sasaki-san in terms of talking about the values that you incorporate, that should be incorporated in supply chain enhancements. So Agneta, John, Parag, and Sasaki-san.
Thank you. So maybe let me just kick it off then. Digitalization, digital transformation, it's something we started on already a couple of years back, more intently, but as a business, and had a strategy. What's happening now? How does it help? So there is a belief, I think, when this all started, that the difficult thing about the digital transformation is finding the right tools, the software, the clever algorithm. I think what those of us that worked with this for a while find is actually the harder part. We want to go digital, but in reality, it's the human component that is the challenge and the change process that we have to go through in actually adapting and really embracing these tools. So I think what the pandemic is doing is, by forcing us as individuals at all levels to actually use more digital tools, it's building that familiarity and actually creating a sort of a catalyst to be more adaptive, because we still have our same goals and we want to deliver on those goals. So I think what is really helping is adding those skills. And I think it's also, even though I know it's incredibly hard with homeschooling for many that's having to do that remotely, but I think it's also helping a lot of children to become much more familiar with some of these tools, which will actually serve them well in the years ahead. And I think that's really how it is helping the acceleration, by just building the skills and the familiarity to the tools themselves, and really having to rely much more on data, because at the end of the day, that's a part of the digital transformation too, is really data. The software is, in some ways, I would say, the easier bit once you've decided what it is that you need. But getting people on board is where I think this is helping.
Thank you, Agneta. John, disparity, digital access.
Yeah, I think in terms of healthcare and delivery of healthcare, that digitalization actually acts more as an equalizer. We've seen across ASEAN that even in some of our less developed countries, that they have managed to stand up some quite unique and amazing digital solutions. Here I'm talking about Indonesia or in Vietnam, etc., where the access to the internet and to digital tools in general is actually quite amazing. And so it really, in my view, the biggest challenge is that obviously when we look at digitizing something internally, we just need to make a decision, make the investment, and everyone, or most people get on board and we move ahead. The biggest problem when you are talking about multiple stakeholders in the provision of a service, whether it's manufacturers, healthcare providers, government actors, etc., is actually getting everybody, every participant in that value chain, first of all, to recognize the need for moving ahead and the value that digitization can create for the broader population, and then to move into kind of an implementation phase. What we found in the healthcare area is that very often, even though we have a very strong intent to digitalize the pieces of the value chain that we own, other participants along the value chain are less willing or less able to do that. And again, I come back to the issue of collaboration here, where if you decide that you want to get broader access to healthcare for your broader population, whether they are remote or poorer or have access to a computer or a cell phone, those digital tools exist. They are relatively cost effective to implement. You just have to have all participants willing to get involved and to make that investment for the greater good of the population.
Thank you, John. Parag, online learning.
Yes, okay. If I could learn to unmute my microphone, that would make me better qualified to answer this question. Just to echo Agneta's point, for anyone who's had children who have had experience either weeks or months of home learning and lockdown, I think we all know that from the children's standpoint and from our own, for the sake of our own sanity, having kids in school is a far superior experience, and I think there's something almost emotionally overwhelming about the happiness that kids have when they are physically able to go and convene with their fellow little people, and how much they just enjoy the camaraderie. So I think we should really appreciate how important it is to, reestablish that, sort of patterns of schooling where they've been disrupted, and obviously to create those environments where they're lacking. So the initial part of my answer is primarily around the physical, and in a way, not a rejection of the virtual, but to acknowledge its limitations when we're dealing with younger people. Where I do think it's extraordinarily important and has already proven to be effective is in the vocational domain. When you're talking about people who are already digital natives, who are already spending a lot of time online, in any case, how can they spend less time playing, video games and more time learning a skill? It could be acquiring a foreign language or the professional vocabulary needed for a certain job. It could be watching instructional videos and passing certain, tests or modules in order to learn a skill to prepare for a job. Things like this. In that environment, I think we already know that digital education can be extremely efficient and can remove the inefficiencies of needing to physically go to a place to sit in a classroom and hear something that you can just as quickly watch, and even watch at a faster speed so that you quickly absorb what you need to know. So what we need to do is to be designing far more curricula across all of the many vocational skills areas, and translating those, of course, as much as possible into local languages. So that is a huge opportunity. And I want to obviously encourage anyone who is an investor, an educator, an entrepreneur, to look at exactly that opportunity, because there, when you're talking about a very young and mobile workforce, such as we have in ASEAN, the sky's the limit in terms of the gains to productivity that such tools could bring about.
Thank you very much. Sasaki-san, can you elaborate further on the points you were making in terms of strengthening of supply chains? In particular, the point you were making about how we need to incorporate some new values in the way we assess the supply chain. How is that going to work?
Okay. Today, global companies have been building complicated and multi-layered supply chains across a wide range. At the same time, the scope of responsibility required for a company is expanding, not only to the products it directly deals in, but also to the products of its business partners. In addition, as a new post-corona economic social order develops, it cannot be overlooked that there are greatly increasing factors which should be considered in establishing supply chains. For example, climate change, geopolitical risks, and government policies that encourage companies to respect human rights. In response to these trends, we should recognize that the more complex these factors become, the more difficult it is for companies to handle them alone. I think the roles of governments and trade promotion organizations like JETRO in solving these issues have become even greater. Regarding the respect for human rights within supply chains, each company should fully understand the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights adopted in 2011 and recognize it as its own problem without leaving it to lawyers. In addition, while the concept of human rights due diligence is important, its essence is engagement with stakeholders. Japanese companies can implement an effective human rights due diligence in cooperation with their stakeholders. It is important for Japanese companies to raise awareness and convey their practical efforts to suppliers and business partners. These activities will make supply chains resilient and sustainable in a mutual manner. As I mentioned, in an era in which we must take responsibility for human rights, it is important for us to ask ourselves on a daily basis how we can do this across entire supply chains. So that's what I would like to mention about this value change in supply chain. Thank you very much.
I want to dig deeper into the point that you made about human rights. Does this not complicate the way we assess supply chains, since there is so much disagreement as to what human rights entail? Do you have a comment on this, Parag? Because, I mean, it seems to me that we are living in a world where, despite our best efforts, we don't agree on many of the fundamentals of what comprises a good society and what comprises the most important human rights. If companies have to assess supply chains in terms of human rights, does this not create a problem?
Well,
is there some way of thinking about it?
Well, I don't have a may I?
Yeah, sure.
I don't have a clear answer, but as I mentioned, what is important is to think about this issue as one of them, themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, it's human rights. Of course, it's the value is different, people by people, but what the company should be responsible for is now changing, and companies should think this problem as its own problem. So that's what I would like to add. Thank you very much.
Parag, comment?
I don't think we have to agree on what the nature of a good society is to have a consensus around what kinds of interventions or policies or institutions can promote better governance and higher the degree of dignity for people and performance of government. This is what I've called the so-called new Asian values in my previous book, where I spoke about far-sighted governance, maybe technocratic governance, in the sense of having very strong independent public institutions, also a collaborative role between the state and the private sector, so a mixed capitalist kind of approach, and then a certain degree of sort of social solidarity as, you know, three critical factors that I do believe that Asian people broadly subscribe to. On the issue of the role of business and foreign investment, here it may seem provocative what I'm about to say, but it's quite frankly grounded in a century or more of history, which is that if you genuinely want to achieve or bring about or contribute to a positive social transformation in a society, you do have to invest there. You cannot simply throw reports at them and tell them that they need to do better. You cannot simply say, you know, here is a World Bank study, right? And you cannot simply criticize them and issue, you know, statements of condemnation. The true pathway to transformation lies with engagement. And the most powerful force for achieving those transformations from the outside, if you cannot be part, if you are not a part of the system internally, is investment. And I know that brings with it certain conundrums about whether or not one is abetting a certain type of regime and so forth. But ultimately, there is no other proven way than to actually engage directly in the country and to create local jobs, to transfer skills, to bring about new power centers and competitive power centers through commercial activity and dynamism. And I know that it is, again, a path that is ethically challenged. It's a path that is heavily criticized by many people, but it is absolutely the proven path that works. And so I believe that all of you who represent businesses that do invest in troubled areas, I think you do need to stick to your ground.
Thank you. We have had a fascinating conversation for the last hour, and I think in the few minutes left that we have, it would be good to talk about opportunity. It's always uplifting to conclude a discussion like this at a time like this by reflecting on opportunity. And as is commonly observed, crisis brings about opportunity in that it forces us to rethink, reinvent, reimagine the way we do things. So I'd like to invite each of you to put on the table one major opportunity you see arising from this crisis that we have, this impact of this pandemic, which will sooner or later be behind us. We have learned a lot from it. It has changed the way we do things. It's changed the way we think about things. What is one big opportunity that you can think of arising from this crisis that we've had? I'd like to start with Agneta, and then John, and Sasaki-san, and then Parag.
Thank you. So one of the real opportunities I see through this, so a crisis like this can either divide or it can bring people together, and it can bring nations together, their society together. ASEAN. I think if we look at this distribution of vaccines, for instance, that has the opportunity to actually build relationships by a just distribution of it, or it can divide those that have and have nots. So for me, there's a real opportunity here to ensure that as a region, work together, get vaccines distributed, and actually reopen the movement across the borders. And thereby, I think you will reestablish the economies and really, I think, allow people to better their lives. And that's what I see as a real opportunity here.
Opportunity for collaboration, bringing people together.
Collaboration.
Very good. John.
Yes, I think, again, the crisis itself has had many negatives. It's been a tragedy for a lot of people in a lot of countries. But there is a positive side in that it has highlighted, I think, a lot of the weaknesses in our society that perhaps over time, as the world was developing in a positive direction, we became complacent about. And so I think for me, the most important thing is that we take the learnings and the issues that have arisen out of the crisis, and make sure that we address them, whether that's the inequality of healthcare, access to healthcare, whether it's inequality of access to vaccines, accelerating digitalization, making sure that supply chains are more resilient in the future. All these things have really come to the fore as a result of the pandemic. And I think it's up to all of us, both in the private sector and the public sector, to take those learnings now and to really transform what we do in ASEAN so that ASEAN is a better place to live in the next decade.
So ensure that we learn what we have learned and keep learning, keep remembering those lessons.
Well, and make the lessons actionable. Yeah.
Yeah, that requires some optimism. I'm a little pessimistic sometimes about human capacity to remember lessons learned, but let's hope that we do.
Indeed.
Sasaki.
Yes, as proposals to ASEAN leaders, in the short term, we would like you to promptly promote coronavirus vaccination and create an environment where foreign companies, including Japanese, can operate with peace of mind. In the mid to long term, we would like to see further cooperation between ASEAN companies and Japanese. The key to cooperation is digitalization. In February of this year, JETRO launched J-Bridge, a new business platform that deepens collaboration between ASEAN companies and Japanese companies. Collaboration is already underway with the keyword innovation and sustainability. We want to contribute to solving social issues not only in Japan and ASEAN, but also around the world. The most important partner for Japan is ASEAN. I hope that the cooperation between ASEAN and Japan will deepen further in the future, and JETRO wants to contribute to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So cooperation through digitalization.
Yes.
And cooperation with JETRO.
Thank you very much.
Parag.
I'll end with there's a very important two-word term in trade, which is open regionalism. And open regionalism means that not only will ASEAN and should ASEAN do more to further eliminate and reduce internal barriers and restrictions so that it does become a whole greater than the sum of its parts, so that it becomes more internally integrated and resilient, but also that it be as open as possible to global trade agreements, whether it's TPP, RCEP, with the European Union, for example, and other arrangements. And open regionalism is by far the most successful, trade and economic strategy that a sub-regional unit like ASEAN can pursue. And that should be the number one priority around which there should be strong consensus among ASEAN governments so that they move together in that spirit and in that direction in the years ahead.
All good things must come to an end. We've had a fascinating, insightful, useful discussion. I have been to many of these conversations, and I have taken a number of notes. I've learned a lot from this conversation. So thank you very much, Agneta, John, Sasaki, and Parag. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you for sharing your time with us at this ASEAN Business and Investment Summit on the future of ASEAN. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
And we all also took a lot of notes too during that very relatable conversation. Thank you, Dato' Tim, and all of your speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, as per our program, we now have a short networking break. Now, we are going to stick to our program as close as we can, which means we have got 7 minutes for a break. We look forward to your return in 7 minutes for a presentation on ASEAN's care economy. We'll see you soon.